All right, today we're jumping into the really incredible story of Saint Gertrude. She was a 13th century leader who found this profound strength right in the middle of absolute chaos. And her journey, it really makes you ask a timeless question. How do you stay centered when everything around you just feels unstable? This was the central challenge Gertrude was facing. And honestly, her answer is what makes her story so powerful, even all these centuries later.
So let's get into it. Our story starts with an unexpected abbess, a leader who really was never supposed to be in this position.
Okay, so to really get Gertrude, you've got to picture the world she was living in. We're talking the late 13th century, and it was messy. You had monarchs changing, factions at each other's throats, and this wasn't some distant political drama. No, this chaos was right on her community's doorstep, and it was right in the middle of this firestorm that she was chosen to lead.
And get this, she was only 30 years old. Just think about that for a second. The sheer weight of that responsibility. At an age where most of us are still kind of figuring things out, she was suddenly tasked with guiding her entire community through a life or death crisis.
And the way she came to power, well, it wasn't your typical election, not at all. Her leadership was actually prophesied by a holy man. So right from the get-go, this wasn't just a job for her. It was seen as her destiny, something she had to step into, whether she felt ready or not.
And you can bet the challenges started coming thick and fast. It's one thing to talk about being a leader, but it's a whole different ballgame when a real crisis hits.
So she was basically fighting a war on two fronts. On the outside, you had this calamity threatening their very existence. But internally, she was carrying all of that weight herself, suffering right along with her sisters and feeling every single fear as if it were her own.
The atmosphere was one of extreme terror and anxiety. This wasn't some small hiccup, This was a full-blown crisis that shook everyone to their core and tested their new, young leader to her absolute limits. So what did she do? Where did she turn for strength?
And this is where her story gets really interesting. Her strength didn't come from some clever political move or a grab for power. It came from somewhere much, much deeper. Her divine intimacy. Now, to really understand her, we have to talk about this idea of the divine spouse. And for Gertrude, this was not just a pretty metaphor. This was real. It was this deeply personal, loving, and constant relationship with God. It was an intimate presence that became the absolute bedrock of her reality.
And you can just hear the power of that connection in these words. This wasn't about duty or fear. It was about joy, love, and what she calls ineffable sweetness. Right in the middle of all that external terror, this was her sanctuary. This was her source of strength.
And because she had this incredible inner wellspring of joy, she was able to completely transform the community around her. She actually worked to turn the monastery into what the text calls a pleasure house. Now, we're not talking about worldly pleasures, but of a place of fervent spiritual devotion. Her inner peace literally became the entire community's strength.
A divine voice is said to have described her this way, and it just gets to the very heart of her leadership style. Her own desire for spiritual purity made her radically empathetic. She felt the flaws of others so deeply that she couldn't see them without emotion. That is a truly profound form of compassionate leadership.
So this intense spiritual life, it wasn't just a comfort. It fundamentally changed who she was as a person and as a leader.
So how did this transformation actually happen? Well, her path seems to follow three key steps. First, she learned to embrace humility, recognizing her worth came from her generosity of heart. Then came what's called perfect obedience, a complete alignment of her will with the divine. And the result of all that? A peace so profound that, get this, she wasn't even afraid of a sudden death anymore. She had total trust. This passage here just captures that final state of being so perfectly. Her trust was so complete, she would prefer whatever God willed for her, even in death. That's what it looks like when faith completely replaces fear. This was the ultimate source of her resilience. So, when we look back, what's the lasting legacy of this 13th century abbess? What are the key takeaways from her incredible life? Well, it really boils down to these hallmarks, this radical empathy, a will that was no longer just hers alone, a peace that worldly crises couldn't touch, a deep generosity of spirit, and a dynamic faith that was always alive and active. You see, she wasn't just surviving the turmoil, she was transforming it through her inner strength.
And that brings us right back to where we started. Gertrude's story suggests that the most powerful anchor in a storm isn't found out there in the world, it's found within. And that leaves us with a final thought to ponder. In our own turbulent times, where will you find that unshakable peace?